Olá, esse é mais um Arqueologia em Ação e hoje nós estamos aqui no Museu de Arqueologia e Etnologia da UFPR, em Curitiba, para entrevistar o Dr. Otis Crandell. The first question I have to you is about your main research area. That's arqueomineralogy. So what is arqueomineralogy?
Arqueomineralogy is the use of mineralogy methodology, but for archaeological questions, problems, research.
And how are these methods for applying them on archaeology?
One of the really popular methods is using thin sections. So we'll cut the artifact or some raw materials. It could be stone, it could be ceramics or other materials. Cut a very thin section and we'll view it under the microscope, the same way as if we were looking at just rocks to look at the minerals, what they contain. But instead of just looking at rocks, we're also looking at some man-made materials or some man-made objects. So we can compare what mineral contents it has, what they look like, how they're arranged, what proportions they have. And we're looking at the artifacts as well as possible raw materials for these objects.
Right. And what would you say that's what's the importance of these studies for archaeology and for science?
Well, it's one more method of adding information to what we get from other sources. So I mean, a lot of times we just look at the object and we say, okay, it's this color, it's this texture, it's this shape, and well, that looks like this material. So we've got a certain amount of information we can gather with our eyes, with our hands, and this just adds more to it. So it's a sort of a supplementary source of information. Sometimes we can use it to identify a possible source of a material, like we have a stone artifact, and we say, where did it come from? If we can compare, not just the visual characteristics, but the microscopic or the petrographic characteristics to the raw material characteristics and the artifacts, we may be able to say, which of these source materials it belongs to. It's also used a lot in ceramics, and in that case we can say, not only what does it contain and where might those raw materials have come from, but we may also say maybe what temperature it was fired at. So we can tell a little bit about the production technology.
And there are some difficulties to work with arqueomineralogy for applying these methods.
Yes. Largely it's you have to have a bit of background in identifying different minerals and knowing what do they look like, maybe what, if it's in the case of ceramics, what temperatures will those minerals melt at? Once they melt, what will they recombine as at a different temperature? So largely, it's not so much a theoretical problem. It's just a matter of, it's a skill you learn to memorize a lot of the different minerals. You also have to have access to some equipment, but it's, comparatively speaking, it's not really exotic equipment. You need the microscope. You need, some basic equipment to cut the objects you're going to study. So there's some minor difficulties, but not every archaeology department has the equipment. But fortunately, we can usually find a geology department which has this equipment, or may even have, someone who is a geologist but interested in this method, and together with the archaeologist, they can overcome this. It's a simple difficulty.
Is there many people working with that around the world in archaeology, like applying mineralogy to archaeology?
I think that there is now. It's become, I think, quite popular. I would say probably in the 60s, there was a big increase in processual archaeology, and one of the things was applying different sciences to archaeology. So yeah, I'd say that there's a fair number of people working in it, but unfortunately, it's not usually something that archaeologists are taught. It's usually something that you get a geologist and you have an archaeologist, and then the two work together to produce this. So I don't really know how many archaeologists out there who are actually originally archaeologists and have moved into the geological sciences as opposed to have come the other way. So, but I'd say there's a fair amount of people, but just it's usually because of a collaboration.
Most of your studies are in Romania, right? Why did you choose Romania for studying?
Oh, it's a little bit of a coincidence, I suppose. It was a bit chance. I was there visiting and doing a bit of work, and I met up other colleagues, and we were looking at some stone artifacts, and there was the question: I was curious, where did the tool material come from? And it was not really known. There was a few guesses, and I said, well, let's spend a little time. Let's go look for some of the raw materials, and we'll compare the local materials to these artifacts, these tools, and see, is it the same thing or is it actually something else? And then we started to see that, the situation was not so simple as, had been previously thought. It was, a lot of people are thinking, well, it was in the Stone Age, everything was local. There was no massive import at that period. So then we started to see whether, in fact, it was quite different, that there was a lot of imported material. And there wasn't a lot of people working on it in that region. There had been a fair amount of work south of there, in the southern part, in the Balkan region. So it was an opportunity to do some new work, or to apply some old methods to a new location. So, and I became interested in it for that. A bit of a chance, a fortunate one, though.
Did you focus your studies in any period time?
I did a few different time periods, but most of it was in the Neolithic and the Chalcolithic. So the late Stone Age and into the Copper Age, when people were still very much like the Neolithic, like the Stone Age, but they had some new technologies and some new changes were starting to occur. It was the lead into the Bronze Age.
In your opinion, what distinguished these periods from the previous ones based on your studies?
Well, I'd say not so much on my studies, but in general. One of the key things that is used to identify the Neolithic as opposed to the Mesolithic or Paleolithic before it is the introduction of agriculture, people becoming more sedentary. You're getting a little bit more trade. You're also getting the use of carved stone. So before this, you're looking at just knapped stone, like your blades, your scrapers. It could be axes, but they're chipped axes. Whereas once you get into the Neolithic, then we're starting to get carved stones or ground stone. And there's some advantage to this technology. There's also advantages to farming, because you no longer have to go out and hope to find some animals. You don't have to find a way to keep the meat fresh, because the best way to keep meat fresh is to keep the animal alive. So and close by, so that when you want it, you can kill it and have then your meat's ready for eating. So these are some of the big changes that take place in this time period. And we know that these changes first occur in the Middle East, and then later they move up the Balkan Peninsula, and then we get into the area where I was working. So there's other questions about this as well, about how do these areas differ? But these are the basic things. We're getting farming, more sedentary, groundstone technology.
What would you say that are the most interesting aspects of this research, on your researches? What do you find out that's the most interesting stuff?
For me, one of the interesting things, and I think for a lot of people, there's other people doing some similar work on this, is the idea of how complex by our nature, and how old are things like inter-settlement connections, and economics. So I mean, there's obviously at some point in our history, we were just individual families. Maybe like chimpanzees or gorillas might be today, you had a troop or something. But at some point in time, we became huge collections of people. And these collections of people were dealing with other collections of people. So, I mean, you could have a village here or a settlement, and they were interacting with the next settlement. Were they interacting with the one beyond that? Were they interacting with ones hundreds of kilometers away? So this has been a bit of a question of, when did this develop? Is this a relatively recent thing? Does it date back to the Stone Age? And for quite a while, the idea was that during the Bronze Age, or possibly during the Chalcolithic, in the Copper Age, when this new material came about, copper, metal, that instantly there was this demand for it. And because people really wanted it, it was a technological advantage to have it. It was a novelty, perhaps, that these trade networks developed. And all of a sudden you had now trade, you had communication, and that this came about during the Copper Age or during the Bronze Age. But what I'm finding now is that, and other people are, in other parts of the same general region of Europe are looking at this as well, and it seems quite clear nowadays that it actually dates back at least until the Neolithic, possibly even further back, but definitely during the Neolithic, we had trade networks where people were importing and exporting materials. We don't know all of what they were importing and exporting because the wood, the grain, the food, other food things, they disappear and we'll never find them. But with the rock, we can definitely say it came from here and we found it way over there. And sometimes way over there is 200 or 300 kilometers away. Sometimes it's over a mountain range. You may have to cross not hills, but actual mountains, follow, some route through a mountain pass to get to the other side and then go further on and there's the source. So this is not, some lone traveler just happened to have dropped an object or he was making some long distance travel and traded his last, stone tool to someone. Because some of these sites from the Neolithic, we have, 2/3 of the lithic tools are imported from very long distances. There's more imported stuff than local. And some of them even have within, 5 kilometers, within, a 2 or 3 hour walk over, not even with roads. If you just walked for 2 or 3 hours, you would come to sources of material which was perfectly fine. It was not extremely high quality, but it did all the stuff. We've seen artifacts, scrapers, blades, and all sorts of other tools made from this material, and they seem to have worked perfectly fine. They have use wear on them. Yet, instead of taking this really easy material, 2/3, half, 3/4 of their artifacts, of their tools, were being imported. And to be doing it on this scale, there had to have been some sort of system. They had to have, known at least the people next to them. They could have been trading, hand to hand, village to village. There could have been some people who from time to time went on a journey or went part way and exchanged with other people who were traveling part way. There could have been, fairs, sort of a prehistoric type of fair where, once in a while people brought material. We don't know yet the exact dynamics of it, but very clearly when that much material is coming in, there's a system. It's some sort of organized system, which means that, even in the Stone Age, at least in the Neolithic, perhaps earlier, but in the Neolithic, we had this system of, we knew what was economics. We knew, we were making communication with people far away. So for me, that's the interesting sort of thing, the takeaway from the work that I was doing.
Now you're here in Brazil, making a new research. So you're learning a little bit more about the Brazilian context. You think that these archaeomineralogy studies could be applied in the Brazilian context, how would it help?
I think there's a couple of ways. I mean, it can be used basically anywhere. You can apply these same methods. It's a method. It's not so much applying a theory. You know, it's a method that can be used anywhere. Just like you could use carbon dating anywhere that you have carbon. You could use, you know, ground penetrating radar anywhere where you have certain types of ground. Yeah, it's a methodology, so it can be applied. One of the things you can tell, like about ceramics, we could, you know, look at, you know, what temperature were they firing this pottery? You know, how were they mixing the pottery? Because when you make pottery, it's not just clay. It's clay. And there's a bit of maybe some sand in it. There could be some organic material. You know, what were the proportions? Were they always using the same proportions, like as a very fixed sort of recipe, we might call it, for making ceramics? Other sort of stuff of this nature. We may also say, you know, you could say, well, here we've looked at it. Here's the clay, and here's the temper, the other components that are mixed in with the clay. And are these local materials? Because you can compare it to what's in the river nearby. You say, here's a settlement. What's the nearest source of clay? And maybe it's nearby, maybe it's not. We could also say, what's mixed in with it? And we could look at the different rock materials that are mixed in with the clay, and we say, well, what river, from the nearest river, could we get that same, you know, if we walk upriver, do we have the same type of rocks, which break down into the sand that goes into the river? So this is one thing we can say, like maybe were the pots made locally or not? You know, what was some of the technology and the methods used to make the pots? The other thing that it may be used for is also with some sourcing. Because a lot of times, you know, you will look at like a stone artifact and you say, visually, it looks like this. You know, but visually, like most knapped stone and most ground stone, you know, it's always made from the same categories of materials. It's chert, it's quartzite, it could be rhyolite or andesite. You know, but each of these materials has very limited, you know, visual characteristics. You know, like I could show you some flint from Paris and some flint from, you know, from Eastern Europe. And I could show you ones that look identical, like if you just looked at them. You know, so I mean, there's only a few sort of visual characteristics these materials can have. You know, so we eventually will find another source which has the exact same visual characteristics. So one of the things that we can use the mineralogy for is to add a few more characteristics. So you say, well, now it's brown, it's, you know, it's sort of a medium fine grain, and it's translucent. Okay, now with the mineralogy, we could say, oh, look, it contains a little bit of, you know, dolomite, or it contains a little bit of, you know, iron, or oh, it contains a lot of iron, or the crystal sizes are all the same, or they vary a lot, or are they big, are they small? So it adds a bit more that we could use for sourcing. This is particularly true when you find good quality, when you find tools that are made of good quality stone materials. If they're low quality, there's a very good chance they're local. But it's the good quality ones that you have to wonder about, because you're like, well, I don't know, like someone could have imported that material. And I'd like to know, is it imported or is it one of the local good materials? So it can tell us about trade as well.
Otis, thank you very much for the interview once again. And I'm pretty sure that it's going to help a lot of students in archaeology and future archaeologists to think about one more method of applying things on archaeology. So thank you very much for this.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. Have a very good idea of how something works or how something was or how, you know, it's believed that something occurred, but always keep in mind that, you know, maybe some information is going to come around and you might have to at some point say, I made a mistake. You know, I was going under this assumption. You know, I was basing my ideas on the model that was, you know, popular at that time. That there was a lot of evidence supporting at that time. But, you know, more evidence has come along, more information has come along, and you know, sometimes you have to sort of say, well, I was wrong. You know, I had the wrong idea, and sort of adapt and say, well, I was wrong then, but now I'm going to go with the new evidence and go in the new, follow a new direction. You have to, I think, that's the message I would like to give people to say. You know, keep an open mind and be willing to change your hypotheses as new evidence comes about.